Welcome to this WiseOwl tutorial on automating Power BI reports using Power Automate flows. So here's what you'll learn during the tutorial. So we're going to start with the example that we'll create from beginning to end, and then we'll create a basic Power BI report. You might like to skip that if you're an expert. We'll create a clickable button using the Power Automate visual, and then we'll add actions to the button so that it does what we want it to. We'll then save the changes and most importantly, apply them to the button. And then we'll format the button to make it look good before testing it out to see if it actually works in a variety of different places and ways. What I'll then do is show how you can edit the flow in both Power BI reports and in Power BI Desktop and in Power Automate, and explain that it's much better off doing it in Power BI Desktop. And finally, and possibly most importantly, I'll show some of the limitations to creating flows in Power BI reports. But I think that's enough of looking at me. I'm going to vanish now. And let's get started. So here's the example we're going to do for this tutorial. We're going to create a report in Power BI Desktop, which shows for each one of 3 environments, the sales by region. A very, very simple report. There'll then be a button at the bottom, which when you click on it, will run a Power Automate flow. And what that will do is send the data for the current filter context to a designated person. I'm going to send it to myself, Delegate 51. So let's see that in practice. So this is a published version of the report. And what I'm going to do initially is choose water, and I'll make sure I've chosen all the regions. So I'm going to click on the button at the bottom to send the email. After a short pause, it's triggered the flow. You can see that. We're going to hear a quiet little ping to show the Outlook email has arrived. I don't know if you heard that there. And this is the email which has been sent out. So it says, you might like to consider this report data, and then it gives the data for the current filter context. It's chosen the water environment, but because I didn't choose any regions, it's listed them all out. And then it signs it with the person who is currently using the report and who clicked on the button. Just to prove that worked, I'm going to do one more example. This time I'll choose land, and I'll choose the Northwest region because that's where I happen to be sitting. Make sure I've actually chosen that. It can be quite hard. So now if I click on the button, I'll hear another ping in a second, but when I go to Outlook, you'll see this time I've just sent the data for the land environment and the region I've currently got selected in my filter context. So you can see this would be a very useful thing to be able to do, to have a button which you would click on to automatically notify somebody of some data changes or something they needed to take a look at in more detail. What we're now going to do is see how we got this all to work. So we're going to start by loading up Power BI Desktop, which always takes a second or two. For those who already know Power BI Desktop, you might like to miss out this stage of the tutorial. I'm just going to create a basic working report so everyone can follow along. So I'm going to get data. The place I'm going to get it from is an Excel workbook. Now, if you look at the notes attached to this YouTube tutorial, you can see the location on our website where you can download these files. And what you'll see is there's a file called constructor creature. And if I use that to get my data, that should enable you to follow along with this tutorial. So I'm just going to choose, in fact, let's make life simple. I'm going to choose all of the tables, even though I don't necessarily need them all, and then just click on the load button to load them all up. I think the only ones I'll actually use are the region and the purchase tables. So now I've got my data loaded up. You can see it listed on the right hand side here in a second. What I can do is start to create my report. And the first thing I'll do is create a slicer. So to do that, I can click on the slicer visual. Welcome to Power BI if you've never used it before. And then I can choose, with that selected, to display the region name. Apologies, I can choose to display the environment name, that's better. And then I could, if I like, format that. I'm just going to do a very little bit of formatting because I much prefer horizontal slices, which I can do by choosing tiles. I'm going to choose single select, and I'm just going to make it look like that. And because I'm an inveterate formatter, I'm just going to set a title and set this to say choose environment. And what I'll probably also do is just go back and get rid of my slicer header. And I'll resist the temptation to do any more formatting for the moment. Will I? Just quickly apply a theme. So one of the other files provided with this tutorial is a theme. And if you apply that, it will make everything look prettier, arguably. So underneath that, now I need to create a table. So I'll click off my slicer I'll click on my table icon. And what I'll do with the table selected is get it to display the region name and also the purchase quantity. And give or take a bit of formatting, that's what we're going to work with. So what do I mean by give or take a bit of formatting? Well, I've just sneaked in a few other things. I just put a title on this and change the column names and apply columns to the numbers in the report, just because I couldn't resist it. So that's my basic report. Time now to create a button. So before we go any further, there's something I really need to stress. You need to make sure that you're logged on with the correct environment. You can see at the top right of the screen, I'm logged on as Delegate 51. And the reason that's so important is when you click on this button to create a Power Automate flow, which we'll do shortly, what it will do is store that flow within the same user's default environment. So this is one I did earlier, and you can see that it's created the flow attached to that button within the default environment for Delegate 51. Unfortunately, the first time I was creating this, I neglected to do this. I created a whole report, but I did it in completely the wrong user account, and I had to start again. So make sure you are logged on as the correct user. That said, we can now create our button. So if you click on the Power Automate for Power BI visual and create your button. The easiest way to move it I found is to click on these three dots and click and drag on that. And what I can now do is to assign some fields to that. So when I click on this button, the information I want to be available so I can send it as part of my email is the environment name, which I will drag into my Power Automate data field. I want the region name, and I also want the quantity. Don't worry too much about the fact that I've renamed them for my report as region and sales. I'm going to use the original underlying names instead. So just before we assign actions to our button, there's a file attached to this video called htmltablestyling.txt. It's a bit optional really, so nice to have. If you go into that to edit its contents, and then what I'm going to do is copy the entirety of those. And what this will do is add some styles to make my HTML table containing the results in the email look nicer. Very much a nice to have, I will admit. Back to Power BI. So what I'm going to do is to assign actions to the button I've just created. I moved it up here to make it easier to see it's distinct from the table. And to do that, you can click on the three dots at the top right and choose Edit. And what this will do is essentially take you into a copy of Power Automate embedded within Power BI. Only the options available are less than they would be, because obviously you're using a restricted set of things you can do. I want to create a new flow, so I can click on the new button at the top left. Regular viewers will know that I don't like templates, so I'm going to choose an instant cloud flow. If you're wondering why it didn't ask me what trigger I want, that's because that is filled in automatically. The only way you can possibly run this is by clicking the Power BI button, so that trigger is essentially added automatically for you. All I need to do now is to add in my actions. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to set a value of a variable holding my CSS. I'm going to create an HTML table, and then I'm going to create an email action to send that to myself. So the first step will be to create a variable. So I can choose variables as my group. I'll choose to initialize a variable. I'll call my variable CSS. It's going to hold a string of text, and I'll paste in the value of that string of text. As I say, strictly speaking, I don't need this. It's just to make the results look neater. What I'll then do is create another step, and this will be to create an HTML table. Again, regular viewers of this tutorial series will know this. I think this is the best way to present data neatly. So what I want to do is create an HTML table, and the place I'm getting my data from is here. And what you can see is it automatically exposes or shows to you all the possible data fields that I could pick up from Power BI. I guess these divide into three categories. There's things which are nothing to do with the data itself, like the user's email and the timestamp. Then there's things which will cause problems if you add them. So all of these fields here, the environment name and the region name and the quantity there, are individual columns. And if you add those, Power BI or rather Power Automate, I guess I should say, will automatically add an apply to all items loop because you're looping over all the rows in the filter context. So instead of doing either of those two, what I'm going to do is to choose the Power BI data. And what that will do is automatically put whatever fields I defined for my button will automatically be added in as a table in the HTML table. So what I can now do is go to advanced options and I can give each of those a name. I'm going to go to custom, and when you go to value, you can see now that I can put in the individual columns. So I'm going to go show the environment, which I'll call environment. I will show the region, which I'll call region, and then I will show the quantity, which I'll call sales. So that's what my HTML table is going to look like. What I can now do is add my third action to send an email. So to do this, I will send an email. I'll do it using Outlook. I'll send it to myself. Normally you wouldn't do this, of course, you'll send it to somebody else. The subject will be, look at this data. And then I can actually put the text of my email. I can find it down here. And here is the data from this report. And then what I want to do is include two things. The first thing I'll do is include my CSS. That won't appear in the email, but what it will do is control how the HTML table looks. And then I can add the HTML table, which is the output from the previous stage. And that completes my action. So I'll just collapse that. So what it will do is when someone clicks on the button, it will create my variable, create the table from the data which has been passed to this button, and then send this out as an email. So what I can now do is to save and apply my changes that I've made, having completed my flow. And to do that, I firstly, rather obviously, click on the Save button. But that doesn't actually do everything. What that does is it makes sure the flow is saved, but doesn't actually apply to the button. So you've now got the situation you have a button which you could click on and a flow which could run, but you need to click and save and apply to make sure that the two things are tied in together, and that's easy to miss out. What I can now do is go back to my report by clicking on the Back to Report button. And I'm going to quickly show now where the flow has been stored. So if I go to Power Automate, which I've got open here, and if I look at my flows, and you can see if I look at my two environments, that's my one I've been using for all the other flows in this tutorial. But remember when you create a flow within Power BI that it puts it in the default environment. So if I go there, you should see my flow listed. And there it is. It wasn't there when I first looked because it needed to refresh. Now what I could do if I liked is to edit this and change the name of it. So what I'm going to do, instead of calling this a long name, I'm just going to say send email of results when click on button. Press return. And then I'll save that. You can also make other editing changes, but later on in this tutorial, I'll show that actually it's quite a restricted interface. And if you're going to make changes, you're much better off doing it back in Power BI. Just before we test our flow, I just want to show you a few things you can do with formatting. This is a very missable section. So what I'm going to do is click on my button to format it and go into the formatting properties. What I would do is change my button text properly. It doesn't have to say run flow. So I'll say click here to email the data. I can change my font color. Let's make it that color. I can change all sorts of other properties about this. I'm going to just increase my font size. And then if you go down, I'll also change the background color. So I'll change the background color to something lighter. And what I could also then do is say what it looks like when someone hovers over it. So at the moment, I'm looking at the default settings. You've also got hover and selected. So I'm going to choose hover and say that when I hover over it, the background will change slightly. Let's have it of that color instead. Now, initially, when you hover over it, oh yeah, it does come up. What I was going to say is when you want to actually try clicking on this, you'll need to hold the control key down. But when you hover over it, the color does show up. I think that will do us. So it's time now to test the button. But before I do that, I think I'm almost certainly going to have to save it. So I'll save it and I'll call it final report. And then I can try testing it. You might have thought, I certainly did, that you would have to publish this to test it, but it somehow appears that you don't. So what I can do is to hover over the button, hold the control key down. You can't see me doing that, but I am. And then click on the button. And with a bit of luck, what it will do is create and send an email. So it's triggering it. And while that's thinking about it, I will go and have a look at my email. Just get rid of 2 old ones I sent in the previous bit. And there's my new email come through. Here's the data in the report, and it's listing out everything in the filter context. What I forgot to do is sign my name. I'll go and add that in later. So that's one way I could run the report. Another way I could do it is from Power BI Service. So what I'm going to do is to publish this report. I'll publish it to my workspace. And in a few seconds' time, that will come up with a message saying it's being published. And while it's thinking about that, let's actually go to Power BI Service. Here it is. Click on my workspace. And is it really still publishing? No, it's not. It's done it. So what I should be able to do is refresh that. And it should see the new report I've just created. I can click on Final Report. Now, I don't wish to give a false impression. It may look like that appeared immediately. It actually took about 2 or 3 minutes on my machine. So just after you've published a report containing a flow, it seems to take forever to refresh. Anyway, so what I'll do now is choose water as my environment, and I'm going to choose the West Midlands region. Let's just make sure I have actually got that selected. I think I have. And then click here to email the data. So this is running the flow from Power BI Service. This time I don't need to hold down the control key because I'm actually being a live consumer of my report. If I go to my emails, I can see that I've got an email containing just the data for water and just for West Midlands. So it all looks like it's working perfectly. Another way I could look at this is I could go to my flow. Let's just go back to my flows and have a look at it there and click on that. And what you'll see is a run history. So you can see there's 2 occasions on which I ran it. One from within Power BI and one from Power BI Service. So everything's looking very good. So I mentioned earlier I hadn't signed my email. What I'm going to do now is go in and remedy this by editing the flow. Now there's 2 ways you can do this, but only one I would recommend. The way I wouldn't recommend is to do it from Power Automate. So it's actually saved the flow attached to the button within Power Automate, and there's nothing to stop me editing it. I did this earlier to change the name. So where I'm sending my email, I can click on that and go down and try signing it. I'll put yours, and then I'll add in my name. And when I click on the dynamic content, you can see that I haven't got much available there at all. I haven't got the name, I haven't got any of the fields exposed by it. It doesn't let me get at any of the information passed in from Power BI. So although I can do that, it's not the best way. So I have actually saved that change. And what we'll do now is go to Power BI and make the change from here. What I can do is click to edit my button. What that will then do is come up with a list of flows attached to it. So what I now need to do is edit the flow attached to the button. And then I'm back where I was to begin with. So I can click on the send an email task. You can see the word yours has been saved because I added that within Power Automate. And what I can now do is get at all the fields available to me. So I can click on username and add that in. And then I can save and apply in one go that. And then go back to my report. And what I'll now do is try this out. Let's choose land and choose northwest. Have I chosen that? I think so. And then if I hold down the control key and click on the button, then what it should do is send a signed email this time. I think it popped up there if I hadn't clicked off it. And you can see it's signed in Delegate 51 and chosen the environment and the region I'd clicked on in the filter context. So that's how you can edit a flow. It's much better done from within Power BI Report, or Power BI Desktop rather, than from within Power Automate. So for the final part of this tutorial, I thought I'd just run through the limitations I know of when using Power Automate flows within Power BI Desktop reports. The first one is any flows that you create from a report are self-contained. So the flow I just created by editing a button in Power BI can't be run from anywhere else. That's probably obvious, but worth stating. The second and probably the most important limitation is that any flows that you create must be explicitly shared with other people who might want to click on the Power BI report button. And in a later tutorial in this series, I hope to cover more about sharing flows, although it's reasonably intuitive how to do it. The third limitation is that any flow you created in Power BI is automatically created within your user's default environment. I mentioned this before, that when I first started creating an example for this, I created my report in the wrong environment and had to start all over again. So do make sure when you're in Power BI that you create your report in the correct environment. And finally, I understand that any data that you send from a Power BI report to a Power Automate flow is limited to a maximum of 1,000 records. It makes sense that Microsoft will throttle that. So those are the limitations, but otherwise enjoy using this great facility to add extra functionality, extra automation to your Power BI reports.